It was a day like any other that the twin-tailed blue-haired girl strode her way into Buena Village, her long and tipped hat bobbing in the wind and her odd hair color standing out to the villagers who were tending to the fields. They whispered to each other in hushed tones, noticing the glimmer of her hair appearing to be almost a tint of green in the morning sunlight. But that couldn't be right. There's no way this girl could be a Superd. Her staff would make a thunking sound as it hits into the earth, with her saying, "Good day," and continuing her journey. That is, until we arrive at a house on a hillside, with a upper level that had recently been reconstructed 2 months ago. She had read about the notice from the Knight of Buena Village, looking for a magic tutor for their son. She would see the cobblestone wall, and outside of it, a fairly young blonde-haired boy outside playing. We would see him, as well as who she assumed was his mother with the same hair color, both outside while she was tending to her trees. Roxy would wave, with her calling out to them, so as to not intimidate them again based on her hair color. "So, where's this brilliant student of mine?" she would ask, looking for perhaps an older sibling of some kind. "Oh, he's right here," and there the son would go, with him smiling and saying, "Hello, it's nice to meet you," his voice bearing a high-frequency pitch. Roxy would sigh, saying, "Well, you hate to see it. Every parent sees their kid with a spark of talent and thinks they're special being an early bloomer." "What was that?" Zenith would say. Paul would have at this point come out of the house and would calm the situation down, saying, "Why don't you give Rudeus a chance to show what he's got?" Roxy would sigh, saying, "Fine, I'll do what I can," and the two parents would head back inside. Roxy would decide to try her best to explain magic theory to this kid, but frankly, she's seen this many times, and there was pretty little hope. She would explain the different classes of magic, with elementary going all the way up to that of Emperor and God, explaining how these techniques differ and the levels of which they need to grow up to gain that point. She herself explained that she's a Saint-class water mage. Anyway, time for you to watch and learn. Watch carefully, I'm only going to do this once, alright? Roxy would take a deep breath, and she then cast the incantation for a water ball. "Let the great protection of water be on the place thou seekest. I call a refreshing burbling stream here and now. Water ball." After saying this enchantment, Roxy would watch as a ball of water would materialize in front of her staff as she pointed towards one of the apricot trees in the courtyard. She would blast the water off at an intense speed, shattering the base of the tree and turning before thumping her staff on the ground, impressed with her own work. "Well, what do you think?" Miss, that's one of my mother's favorite trees. I don't think she's gonna be happy you broke it." After this, Roxy would quickly run over using healing magic, using the divine power that's rich and nourishing to heal the tree and fix it right as rain. She would turn back and tell Rudeus it's his turn to try. Unlike the original Rudeus, Subaru would initially try to complete the entire chant, with him starting with him saying, "Let the great protection of water be on the place thou seekest. I call a But a convenient burst of wind would happen, causing Roxy's skirt to lift. Subaru would immediately lose his focus, with his chant stumbling as he misses the other half of the entire chant, just saying, "Water ball." And the ball would form, with his mental image of Mana still maintaining based off of all of his experience playing games in our world and being a huge weeb. Subaru's water ball would smash forward, destroying the tree that Roxy had just healed, and realizing that this kid had abridged the chant. She would turn and ask him what that was all about, with Subaru being like, "Huh, I didn't see anything." Roxy would then ask if he always abridges the chant like that, with him saying in a shy and sheepish voice, "I only say the chant because I think it sounds cool. I can skip the entire thing." You what?" Roxy would say, shocked. Suddenly, Zenith's voice would come crying out, with her shocked, seeing her prized tree falling to the ground, with her yelling at Roxy saying, "Please don't make my trees your practice targets." And Roxy, of course, now being stunned, thinking she's going to be fired tomorrow. Subaru would do his best to comfort her, telling her that it's not her fault, and would even tell Roxy that it's pretty cool that it's only his first day and he's already been able to destroy a tree like that, huh? Subaru would have one of those eyes closed, big grin smiles, and that would wrap up the first day of training. During the next 3 weeks or so, Rudeus and Roxy would actually have a bit of an argument. Well, a debate is more like it, with Subaru thinking that it makes more sense for him to use the cast versions of the spells because they sound cooler. At this point, he hasn't realized this is a swords and monsters type of kill or be killed world, and is just playing by rule of cool. Roxy, on the other hand, would be thinking of the utility of having castless, wordless magic, and would basically be insisting that he practices using it, with Rudeus sighing and proclaiming he will listen to his master. So basically something that a lot of people pointed out in the last comment section that I completely agree with, by the way, is that Subaru is exactly the type to choose coolness over utility, so he would probably end up using casted spells, which I think will actually help in the long run because he's more likely to use healing magic and actually advance in it beyond like just basic healing and intermediate maybe, because he likes the sound and long casts of spells, so he's actually memorizing them. But I also think that he would be using wordless magic because Roxy would explain to him the benefits of having such an ability and how rare it is. I think the rareness part of it specifically would be what makes Subaru think it's cool and kind of switch his perspective on how useful it is. With him deciding that if Roxy, his master in Shisho, thinks it's cool, then he guesses it's something he should work on. So once again, in a different universe, Subaru is motivated by resting bitch face lollies, so who am I to judge? Anyway, the next time skip that I was talking about would be around 5 weeks after Roxy arrived at the house. With Subaru not having the same limitations as Rudeus, Subaru would actually have adventured out into Buena Village because he doesn't really have reservations about going outside. He was never particularly bullied or anything, he just, basically lost faith in humanity. So whenever he isn't training with the sword with Paul, who he loves training with and also wants to know how to use a sword, he would probably be out goofing around because there's no video games or things to do, aside from reading the books in the house, which he's read all of them as a baby by now because, again, he was bored. And one day, while Subaru was out in town, just walking around in the fields, he would come across a kid with their hood up being bullied mercilessly by 3 others. Subaru would not stand for this, with his father being a knight of justice, a hero. So Subaru would, much like the original Rudeus, get in and help, with him blasting a wave of icy wind, which would cause them to feel the hair on their necks stand up, and the 3 of them run off, saying it's that knight's kid. Subaru would take the snitch status like a badge of honor. Yep, that's me. I'm the son of the knight of Buena Village. Really getting into the whole protagonist syndrome type thing that he had going on in the first season. So I think because of this, Rudeus would actually befriend Sylphie much earlier because he doesn't have that fear of going out. So Roxy and Sylphie might actually meet during Rudeus's childhood. So because of Subaru's social tendencies, it's possible that all 3 of them would train in magic together, or at least Sylphie would come over and meet Roxy. I think the potential of this is pretty interesting, considering that it means Sylphie would have more time to learn magic with Rudeus, well, Subaru, alongside developing Sylphie and Roxy's relationship much earlier, kind of associated with their fates that's connected to the original timeline in the world before Rudeus had survived, or not been stillborn. I don't think Subaru would even try teaching Sylphie chantless magic unless she asked about it, because he's not really proactive like that. But regardless, let's get back to the night that Rudeus had first saved Sylphie. Enough of this theoretical talk. Subaru would arrive home, and when he gets there, Paul would be outside. The day had turned to dusk, and Sylphie had gone home, with Rudeus walking with Sylphie and accompanying her back to her house, being the gentleman that he is. Anyhow, as Subaru gets home, he would see Paul with a look he had never seen before on his face. His eyebrows would be inturned, and his eyes would have this spark in them, like he was going to prove himself or something. Subaru would ask Paul, saying, "Father, you were waiting for me to come home. What's going on?" "Enough of the games, Rudy. Samal and his mom came by here earlier. Did you know that?" "Huh? Samal? I guess. I saw him earlier. And what did you do to him earlier, Rudy? To do to him? I didn't... Cut the crap, Rudy. Listen to... Subaru's face would sting. A burning palm print would have embedded itself into his cheek, but the pain of that was nothing. Nothing compared to the burning he felt inside of his chest. Unlike the original Rudeus, who, if nothing else, could hold himself in an argument, Subaru is not the type to lecture Paul after getting hit like that. Rudeus would look up at Paul, his eyes now narrowing, his tears would fall and streak down his cheeks. Subaru would scream at Paul, saying, "I didn't do anything wrong!" and turn and run off into the darkness. Paul would stand there stunned, watching as his son fades into the shadows, with him calling out for Rudy after him into the dark. From the shouting and the commotion, Zenith and Lilia would poke their heads out of the house, looking out and seeing Paul standing there, looking stunned. And Roxy would come downstairs as well, hearing the house having gone silent. But I digress. Roxy would walk into the conversation occurring between Zenith and Paul, with Zenith asking why he would hit him like that, with Rudeus having always been a good boy and never having done anything like that sort of before. Paul would explain in a sigh that he might have taken it too far, saying that he just wanted to act like a father for once. It's at this point where we hear a little bit about Paul's life, where he says that after seeing him run off like that, it reminded him of what he had done with his father, where Paul had run away and left his family behind, basically never coming back. And that's not something unfeasible for Rudeus to do. Paul would have a hand on his face thinking, is this how his father felt when he ran away? Realizing that he's becoming the man he hated most, the one who had been responsible for his own mother's death. It's at this point that Roxy would make herself known, saying that she'll go and retrieve Rudeus. Roxy would grab her staff, walking out the door saying she'll be back for dinner, telling them just to take it easy and let this blow over. Roxy would smile, seeing this as being the first time that Rudeus had done anything remotely childlike for his age. Of course, she didn't hear his side of the story yet, just hearing that Paul had heard about how he had used magic to bully some kids, which Roxy wasn't entirely sure she believed either. But anyway, Roxy had known Rudeus's go-to spots fairly well, with her walking towards the tree that he usually spends his time reading under, this large great tree on the hillside. She would find him there sitting with his knees cradled to his chest. Roxy would call out to him saying, "Rudy, are you there?" Subaru would sigh, sitting up as he wipes the tears that had already dried off his face, and calling out in a choked voice, "Master Roxy, I'm here." Roxy would walk over, placing her staff down and sitting next to him by the tree. By this point, the sun had long set, and the stars had taken its place in the sky. Roxy wouldn't say anything at first, with it just being silent with the meadow breeze blowing over the grasslands of Buena. After a bit more of this ear-deafening silence, Roxy would pierce the dark with her voice, beginning to tell Subaru the story of her childhood and how she discovered magic. Roxy would go into great detail explaining how she is part of the Magurdia tribe, a tribe of demons who have the ability to use telekinesis, and yet that key trait is something she lacks. Explaining how this pop-crackling sensation would erupt in her mind when people tried to use their telekinesis to speak with her. This telepathy ability just was not something she possessed, and how she felt isolated because of it. Roxy would go into depth explaining everything that had happened, basically on how she became a mage, telling Rudeus about how she had gone to become an adventurer, and how she had ran away from home herself. Roxy would pause here, looking up at the silhouette of Rudeus, and saying that if someone who could already use such advanced magic was really trying to bully kids, then I don't think they'd have come out of it with just a black eye. She would then go silent again. Rudeus would sigh, sniffling as he then explains his side of the story, telling Roxy about how he had seen these 3 kids throwing mud at this girl he met today, Sylphiette. He explained that she had green hair just like the tribe of the Superds that Roxy had told him about. Subaru would explain how he had not used magic, but he had stepped in the way and protected her from the onslaught of bullies, and that's why he'd been out so late. It's after this that Roxy would nod understandingly, with her and Rudeus talking it over a little more before she finally convinces him to come back with her back home. She would follow that up saying maybe he could introduce the Sylphiette to her at some point. Subaru would remember how Roxy had said that at some points she had been mistaken as a Superb herself, so he thought this might be good for Sylphie to see that she isn't alone. Subaru would cheer up, although he now has a mistrust of Paul that had not existed before, with him having seen Paul as this heroic-like figure in his life to this point. Subaru would be inadvertently comparing Paul to his own original parents, who he had a great admiration for as well, and had let down, ultimately. It was the ambitions of the Natsuki family that Subaru had felt entitled to because of being their son that had led him to feeling disheartened and having been completely overwhelmed, ultimately leading to the end of his life last time. But this go around, Subaru, as he opens the door with Zenith hugging him again and Paul looking awkward, Subaru would promise himself that this time, he's going to get serious about living. In the following weeks and months, Subaru would not have forgiven Paul, and of course he'd be going extra hard on him during training with the sword, after Paul had heard from Sylphie after meeting her for the first time how Rudeus had saved her. Paul was feeling extra tons of guilt for hitting his son, who was matching his ideals of being a hero. At the same time, this gap between Subaru and Paul would push him closer to Roxy, with Subaru now focusing more on training his magic over his sword ability, seeing as he's not getting as far with it as he was originally starting it. Subaru would also have brought Sylphie into the fold, showing her magic and how he had defended her against those bullies, along with introducing Roxy and Sylphie to each other, this leading to a form of friendship. Subaru would probably be practicing with Roxy and Sylphie, and would one day just be focusing on his silent casting, to which Sylphie would ask him to teach her about it. Roxy naturally would be curious about this too, considering she's interested in trying to learn castless and wordless spellcasting, but was unable to in the original version. So Subaru would try his best to explain using the gamer terms and lingo he had learned in his previous life, kind of explaining the feel behind mana of when you're casting versus when you're forming the mana in your head. Sylphie would practice this with Roxy, with Rudeus now kind of playing the teacher role, and eventually Sylphie would even start picking it up, causing Roxy to feel true despair, because even this random kid from this backwater village is capable of doing it when she, a Saint class water mage, is unable to. Also, I feel it's appropriate to mention at this time that Rudeus never undresses Sylphiette as a child while being a 45-year-old man, because Subaru ain't about that life. He's not trying to, he's not trying to be Diddy. He's just, he's just being himself. He's just doing his thing. He's just a chill guy, However, I do think that Roxy would still be playing in the Forbidden Dungeon to Paul and Zenith and Subaru would probably know. And I think Subaru would start developing a crush on Roxy. So that would kind of lead us to some future developments there. So he's definitely going to see her in that light, considering he still thinks she's similar to the age he was in his previous life. So I don't think he'd be attracted to Sylphie. Like, he wouldn't be saying all those comments like she's going to be a looker when she's older, all that type of shit. But anyway, one huge difference between the three of them now training together and knowing each other is that, as opposed to the 2 years that Roxy spent with Rudeus in the original, with Rudeus being more motivated and training harder in his free time, Rudeus and Roxy would spend only 1 year in this timeline, with Roxy seeing the immense growth of Subaru now fueled from Sylphiette. The two of them actually would help each other grow in magic much more. Having a training partner to duel with and practice against actually is more motivating. So this kind of evens up the time gap, putting the graduation ceremony a year earlier, which places his graduation to still be the day after his birthday, where he receives the book on plants from Zenith, the first ever sword, like a real sword he gets from Paul, which he would treasure, and the red stone apprentice wand that Roxy especially created for Rudeus as her student. Again, I don't think she would make one for Sylphie because Sylphie's not as advanced as Rudeus is in magic, so she wouldn't have a graduation exam, and she also wasn't paying Roxy. She was just kind of tagging along with Rudeus's lessons anyway. so I don't think Sylphie would come with for the graduation final exam that Roxy would take him to in the field the next day. Subaru would feel uneasy knowing what this meant, knowing that Roxy was leaving and that he had outgrown her. Subaru didn't want to be left behind. He had just made all these new friends, all these new connections in this world, and he wasn't ready for her to go yet. But he knew that she would see right through him if he failed. So he put his all into it and started casting. Grant Spirit of Water and Imperial Prince of Lightning who ascends the heavens. Grant my wish and bring about a savage blessing. Display your might to insignificant beings and strike awe with a blow of your divine hammer on the anvil and cover the land in water. Ah, rain, sweep all else away and expel everything. Cumulonimbus. With Subaru's incredible mana pool, the spell would come naturally, molding the mana into the clouds in the air, and pouring rain would come torrenting down, ripping through the sky as thunder and lightning would crash. The tree in this open field burning from a lightning strike, as Roxy would yell out into the storm saying that's enough, with Rudy now stopping the spell, trying to release the magic. Subaru would fall on his back into the wet grass, looking up at the sky, as Roxy would walk over, looking down at him with her hat completely drenched, saying congratulations on becoming a Saint-class water mage. The following day, Roxy would pack all of her belongings, but before she goes, she would make sure to tell Rudeus something. Telling Rudeus, or Subaru, that there was 2 options for him going forward. As someone who's mastered Saint-tier water magic, there's only 2 countries in the 7-faced world we live in that are specialized enough to actually teach you anything beyond the Saint tier. The first and the closest one is the University of Magic in Ranoa. I actually attended there for a while as a student before I had a falling out with the professor. But it's a good school, and honestly, it's closer and the tuition's pretty affordable. Aside from that, if for some reason you find yourself halfway across the world, past the demon continent even, you could find yourself on the witch continent, in the royal capital Lugunica. Huh? The witch continent? What's that? Don't we have mages here? Roxy would nod emphatically before explaining to Rudeus that while his chantless spellcasting was incredibly rare and a useful ability, he was not the only one who could accomplish it, citing specifically one of the most famous mages in their world, the Emperor-class mage Roswell L. Mathers, a Emperor level in every element class, and a mage who hails from the country of Lugunica from the Witch Continent. Oh yeah, why is it called the Witch Continent anyway? Roxy would explain a piece of lore, again like the Superds, from back during the Great Human-Demon War. Apparently 7 legendary witches from this continent would have joined Laplace in his attack on the human world, and in their doing so, they created 3 legendary horrors, known as the 3 Great Monsters. But enough of that. I'm sure you'll hear lots about that when you start going out into the world a little more. Roxy would pat Subaru on the head before now picking up her staff and her box of things and heading out. Zenith would choke back a tear as Roxy would continue her journey, moving towards Sharia, hearing about an opportunity to be a tutor for a certain royal prince. And that brings us to the end of part 2 for What If Subaru Was Rudeus Greyrat. If you guys are interested and want to see more, make sure to slap the like button, comment down below what you thought, all that good stuff, you know what to do, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks, and ciao.